Welcome, everyone. I'm Valerie Ranke with the Diocese of Olympia, the Episcopal Church in Western Washington. Thank you for taking the time to join us today for this presentation on children's presence in worship, full participation, or brief appearance with Sharon Ely Pearson. As you know, last month, Sharon would have been our keynote speaker and workshop leader at Better Together, the Diocese mini conference on faith formation. That event was canceled, one of the first in the diocese because of COVID-19, but Sharon has kindly agreed to bring that keynote and these workshops to the diocese in an online format. I speak for everyone when I say just how grateful we are to have Sharon's generosity on sharing her knowledge and wealth of experience. A little bit about Sharon. She wears many hats, but you probably know her best as the author, blogger, educator, and basically a faith formation cornerstone of the Episcopal Church. She's recently retired as editor and Christian formation specialist with Church Publishing Incorporated. She brings over 30 years of experience in Christian ed for children, youth, adults on the local, diocesan, and international church-wide level. She's written numerous books, including the bestseller Call on Me, a prayer book for young people, as well as the classic Episcopal Christian Educator's Handbook, and more recently, the delightful 6-book series, Faithful Celebrations, Making Time for God. She leads workshops and retreats on a variety of formation topics, and you can follow her on her blog, roseofsharon.com. So now let's turn it over to Sharon, joining us today from her home in Connecticut.
Before we start talking about children in worship, we need to talk about what we believe worship is, knowing that worship may mean something different to you than it does to me. Worship is primary experience not simply of coming before God, but as a time of disclosing to new and continuing worshipers and ongoing generations understandings of worship, faith, and life. So those three things go together. And worship is also Christian formation. I call liturgy as formation is just as important, if not more so, than perhaps going to Sunday school. Because in worship, our minds are instructed, we learn, we perceive, we can discern things that are happening in worship in our relationship with God through music and prayer and hearing scripture. We have emotions that we are energized with through whatever happens in worship, but also in the interpersonal relationships that may also be going on in the community that we're worshiping with. And then we are more sensitive to the power of God and the work of the Spirit in us. And hopefully, through all of this, through worship, we are worthyship, we're looking to and towards God, that it motivates us to action. So that through that thanksgiving and praise and also confession to God, we can then go forth into the world. Marva Dawn, who I believe is a UCC pastor, writes a lot about worship and has created some liturgical practices. And she feels that worship is edifying. It must be thought-provoking. And specifically, she says it should stir new thoughts about God, new insights into God's character. So worship is about God calling us and forming us to be a community of people that want to pattern our lives on Jesus Christ. So hopefully, worship is transformational for us. It transforms us so that our character then can go out and live faithfully in the world. It happens through prayer. We learn how to pray by praying. We learn how to pray by having conversation with God. And so many people are so not afraid or hesitant, not knowing how to do that. But worship helps us make us comfortable in being able to pray. Worship passes on biblical stories to us, rituals, arts, signs, symbols. We have stained glass, we have music, we might have stations or other art installations, our altar hangings. All of those things are ways to help us encounter God. And it helps us, especially from an Episcopal tradition, our liturgical history, our heritage, and those memories that we've had as a child really shape us. Whether we were raised in a church or not, perhaps we were raised in another faith tradition. Though whatever happened in those worship occasions inform what we believe worship means to us today, and that can be positive or negative. So I always invite people to figure out, what does worship mean to you? Because it may be different than what it meant to the person sitting next to you in the pew or the person leading the liturgy. And think about your most memorable worship experience. I like to do a little bit of Bible study or looking at scripture that has to do with, I believe, worship. So some of these passages are a little bit different. You might not think of these as being scripture that talks about worship, but the first one is Isaiah chapter 6, verses 1 through 8. And that's the passage that has sort of the call of Isaiah, or the vision of Isaiah, that suddenly he's in the presence of God with the seraphim and the cherubim, and there are angels singing, and we hear the Sanctus, which is where we get that in our liturgy. Holy, 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 Lord of hosts, glory be to you. And, so it's a very visceral reading. There are smells of incense. There's a hot coal that gets put on his tongue. And so God is certainly experienced and encountered in a different way there. Very, very physical and memorable. But it is a vision Isaiah is having. And how do we experience God? Do we ever encounter God in that kind of way? I think of one experience that I had at the cathedral, St. John's Cathedral in Denver, for I think it was Evensong or Compline or something. And so it was dark with a little bit of light coming in from the outside. With the church was filled with smoke, and it looked like the Ark of the Covenant up behind the altar, aflame with smoke coming out of it. And you couldn't see hardly anything, but there was this ethereal feeling going on. And I worship at a church that has, if we ever had incense in the building, everyone would leave. So we're broad church, low church in many respects for that. So, but that was a very moving encounter for me personally, because I don't get to experience that very often. Another passage is Jeremiah, which is the call of Jeremiah, in which he is called and known from, God says that he was known from the womb. So how does God know you from the moment that you are born? And where is that? And there's another part that there's a taste involved in that reading from Jeremiah. Then there's the reading from Luke 24, verses 13 to 35, which is the walk to Emmaus, and how Jesus was known to the disciples and those who encountered him. Even though they'd been walking a while, it wasn't until it was the breaking of the bread that they recognized him. So again, that sense of the tangible, sensory expression in which we come to know God. And then the last one was from the gospel this past Sunday, which is of Thomas meeting the risen Christ after most of the other disciples had met him. And all Jesus said was, "Peace be with you." And isn't that what worship is, when God welcomes us into the place and just, peace be with you, even though Jesus could have said to Thomas, "How come you didn't believe what the others said? How come you had to see me first?" Jesus automatically welcomed Thomas in the midst, and that really didn't matter what had happened in the past. That worship is really all about welcome, hospitality, and being open to the presence of God in a variety of ways. Children have an intuitive knowledge of God. I'm not sure if any of you have ever heard this story. It's been in print in numerous resources. And I have a friend who had a similar experience with one of her children when he was born, or when he was able to speak. So he might have been 3 or 4 years old. But basically the theme of these stories are that There's a preschool child who sees an infant. I'll tell you this one particular story. There was, parents who had just come home from the hospital with an infant, and they had a preschooler already at home, and they had a baby monitor, and the preschooler wanted to go into the baby's room by himself to spend time with the baby, and the parents were a little nervous about that, because they weren't quite sure why their older child wanted to do that, but they had the baby monitor, so they listened. And basically what the toddler said to the baby was, please tell me about God, or please tell me what it was like there, because I'm beginning to forget, kind of thing. So this conversation, and that's been reported a number of times from people. And like I said, I have a friend who has a son who's, maybe he's, I don't think he's 30 yet now, but when he was small, he wanted to go back inside his mom, because he said that's where he saw Jesus, and he just kind of said that out of the blue with her one day. They went to church, so he had some of that language, but it was an interesting perspective that he had. So children do have the experience of the holy. So what childs need from us adults are to model religious language, which is what Jerome Berryman would say in Using Godly Play, or Sophia Cavalletti with Catechesis of the Good Shepherd, is how do we model language to help children make meaning of worship, but meaning in life also. Children need adults in a caring community, not just their parents, that witness their faith and help guide them or walk alongside them. And children need adults to assist them in drawing some of that out, in trying to determine what their own truth is, again, by putting some language to it. So it's important in worship that we worship together with all generations, because of that. I think one of the things that Gretchen Wolfe Pritchard, if you've ever read her book, Offering the Gospel to Children, which has been out a number of years, but it's a great text. She writes that adults come to church on Sunday in order to worship. Children come to Sunday school to acquire information. Now, I think what information is important, and learning the Bible is important. But what's really going to form us into people of God is being able to learn how to worship God and be in relationship with God through that. And the only way we can really do that is being all together with that. Whoops. Oh, here we go. I'm just going to hit all of these. Some of you may already know that I'm also a fan of John Westerhoff, and these are some quotes from John from his book, Will Our Children Have Faith? He believes that, if we live as Christians, when we discern what God is doing in the world, we can join God in God's work. Worship should inspire and motivate us for such radical action. He says to transmit faith to the next generation is to include them as participants in the community's rituals. That's one of his main theses in his book, about if our children are going to have faith, they need to be included in our rituals. And then he says, if we are to be formed as Christians, we must take our Christian rights seriously. This means making participation in the church's liturgies the heart of formation. So I believe, I love Sunday school, taught Sunday school for ages and ages, but that what we are really formed together is in liturgy. That's what really helps us understand who we are as Christians in those kinds of things. So Bible stories, catchy songs, classroom creativity, fun snacks, those are really great and those are fun. But how I ask those who do work with children in classroom settings, to make sure that with all of those things that they are connecting to other people when we're doing that, that it is a communal kind of thing and not an individual kind of thing. And of course, the teacher is that person in the classroom who's really building those relationships and modeling that thing, those important assets about how God loves is through ours. But when children are part of a community that models unconditional love and acceptance, then they understand they get a glimpse of God and what God and Jesus are talking about. So to be present in worship in a positive way is how they can get that. And so children will trust and commit to those people when they can see how people trust and can commit to God also. So that's a pretty big responsibility that adults have. And it's not just parents. I would say it's for all in the congregation that's really important too. In talking about, we may all feel that everything I'm saying, yes, this is true. We believe that children are innate spiritual beings. They need to be present with us in worship. But sometimes that isn't easy, especially if there are those in our congregation who feel that children should go off and be in Sunday school when adults are worshiping, that children don't understand what's going on, or it's too boring, sermon's too boring, or the liturgy is too long for them to sit still. I think those are important things to talk about as a congregation. If you're going to have children regularly present in worship, not just for short periods of time, but even for an entire service, for people to have some conversations with adults who may be a little reticent about, why are our children in church all of the time and aren't somewhere else? Because there are two generations pretty much that grew up, myself included, if you listen to my last presentation, that children were segregated. And that was an understanding of that's just how we learned, that we needed to learn in our age cohorts. And that worship wasn't a learning opportunity or a formation opportunity. Worship was a personal experience between one person and God. It had nothing necessarily, it was done corporately, but not really in watching out for our neighbor or worshiping together as a community. So I think it's helpful to talk about that, especially if there are folks who are a little leery about having children present. And then to look about, well, what are the roles that children can play in the life of our church? And when I talk about children, I'm talking about those between the ages of 0 to probably 12. Youth is another category. I think youth should definitely be in worship all of the time. And it's a lot easier for youth to be present in worship all of the time when they've been present in worship as a child, because then they know those routines, and it's suddenly like, oh, all of a sudden I'm not going to be bored in church anymore while we send out the kids at certain times for that. The youth are just going to be just as bored. And I would also say that if children and youth are not engaged in liturgy, that there are probably a lot of adults that aren't totally engaged in the liturgy also. So many adults will say that they love children's sermons that are given to the children. I'm not so sure children love children's sermons. I think adults do, because they understand them then. That's how that works. There's a woman named Teresa Cho who she's a Presbyterian, and she writes, her blog is called Still Waters. And she does a lot of experiential stuff at her parish. I believe she's the lead pastor in her church. And at one point she had realized that most of the adults in her congregation did not know the biblical stories at all. And they were sending children out to go to Sunday school to learn the biblical stories, when she realized, no, the adults are the ones that need to learn the biblical stories. So we need to just all stay together and learn the biblical stories and worship together. So she decided to completely change up what worship was like. And I guess being a Presbyterian, she had a little bit more leeway in what she was going to do with worship than perhaps we do with a prayer book. But she decided she was no longer going to do children's sermons at all, because that's a big thing in Presbyterian churches. They have a children's message at the beginning of the service. Children go off to Sunday school then, and then the adults continue on, because the word and the message is of central importance in the Presbyterian church. So she says, I'm not doing children's sermons anymore. I'm going to use prayer, music, and scripture designed so that parents sit with their children in worship and engage them during these things. That might be a little uncomfortable in an Episcopal church, but there's probably ways of doing that. She decided not to do Sunday school anymore, at least normally, so that it was not going to be held on Sundays. But I think she still continued it for preschoolers. But during sermon time, everybody would break out. So adults would then break out into small groups to discuss the sermon also in age cohorts. I know some Episcopal churches, there was one in Alexandria, Virginia, I went to years ago, that they saved the sermon for the end of the service, so it could be more give and take. Liturgically, I'm not sure if you need a bishop's permission to do that, whatever, but that's what they did, and which was really interesting because everybody stuck around to hear the sermon. And it was more of a conversation too, which was really interesting. She also got rid of the pews in her church. Valerie and I were talking earlier about lots of churches are starting to do that and put in chairs to make worship space more flexible. I mean, that may work in some places, it might not in others. And she said she was going to bring on a projection screen. Now, there are Episcopal churches who use projection screens for broadcasting prayers and music and images. If you've got space and a congregation that wants to do that, that can be highly engaging and sensory. Others, that's I think more any traditional Episcopalian probably might not see. You're not putting up a screen in my sanctuary for there. And interactive experiences for worship she was going to do. So during prayer, they have interactive prayer in which people get up and there might be stations around the sanctuary that people can pray in. Now that's a little more extreme perhaps, but are there ways that we can kind of take and learn from that? At the bottom of my slide and also in the handouts that you did get, there's a link to a document called Authority of All Generations. There's a process in that, it's called Awake My Soul is the book, but Authority of All Generations is a way to gather all kinds of people together to talk about certain things and tell stories and using music. And so that's a great process to use if you want to have a all congregation kind of forum to talk about everybody together for worship for that. So I'm going to go through this one quickly so we can actually share some other ideas and get some questions. 10 Commandments for welcoming children in church. And then there's another flyer that you also got and as a handout. And basically it's a trifold that you can copy on both sides. My church has this. We've adapted it to our own setting. So you can, just use that as an example. And we have those in the pews to let parents know that children are going to wiggle. They're going to move around. That's just what kids do. And it's okay that they do that. To, when children and families enter church, to welcome everybody, not just the adults by giving them a bulletin or a handshake or whatever we do in the future, but to, welcome all ages and to try not to focus on those who are negative about their presence. Because oftentimes those are the ones that have the loudest voices. Also, allow children to participate in leadership in appropriate ways. Children can lecture if they've been given some practice and training. I've had 7-year-olds lecture beautifully. I mean, we practiced a lot, but certainly we didn't want to set them up for failure or embarrassment. And sometimes they make real, because they practice a whole lot, as opposed to some adults who just kind of get up and stumble through of things for that. But not to use children as displays. I think sometimes a children's sermon does that, and everybody think it's real cute with the answers that kids give, because of course, what's the answer always going to be to a question? It's going to be God or Jesus, no matter what, and it's when the other answer comes in that everyone sort of starts to snicker for that. So, and you'll get copies. I mean, you'll get this presentation too, because I added in some other pieces that have ideas for what you can use in worship. One are things that can go in a child's worship bag, or my parish, there's a little table before kids enter the sanctuary, and they have coloring bulletins that and packets of colored pencils that they can take in the pew with them. And the ones we use right now are from Illustrated Ministry. So they follow the lectionary. It's just one sheet. There's no words in them. But it follows whatever the gospel reading is for those. And then there is for older kids, you're going to see these. These are all different kinds of cards, liturgy cards. And they're called a Holy Creative Commons Prayer, and it's by Kyle Oliver, and you can get these from him. The link is on here, and it also, if depending on how you purchase them, you can also get them in PDF format. So these are great ways. They're just pictures, very visual, but in the back of them it talks about what part of the service it is and what it's good for. That's a fun thing to do. And another thing I made for kids, if you can see these, I ran around my church and took pictures of things. So here's our organ. You can see that. And I just went around and just took with my cell phone and then printed them out of pictures of objects. So the pulpit, the hymnal, and then I wrote the name of it on the back. And then I put them in a little binder. And so kids could look around the church during worship to see what the names of all of these things are. There's another one, which I took this parts, and these are illustrations from Gertrude Mueller Nelson, you might recognize. But I just took parts of the service, like that could be the confession. And they're on a ring also. I laminated them or covered them with clear contact paper for those kinds of things. Whoops, let me go on. Whoops, there are all these. I should have clicked this first. So quiet bags, having things that a child can bring in the pew with them. We, recommend parents, if they're bringing something for their child, that it be soft so it doesn't make a lot of noise. Nothing like a Matchbox car going across the top of the pew, if it happens, but it can. This is a wooden butterfly that can be used for threading. I've had pieces made out of felt, a couple pieces of felt sort of stuck together and just hole punched that kids can just spend time. A package of pipe cleaners will last forever with a child just playing with them quietly in the pew. And the thing is, while children are busy doing things, they're still listening and absorbing. There's a little boy, two little boys in my parish who sit in the first pew. And of course, there's no pews like behind them because everybody sits in the back. But when the organ plays the prelude and the postlude, he stands up and conducts. And I mean, the kid's really into music and he really watches it constantly, but he's up front so he can see it. And everyone has really embraced him. That no one laughs at him. They just think it's wonderful that he does that. His mother's horrified, and we've just told her he's loving this. Let him do that. Years ago, also in another parish, there was a family who always sat up front, which I encourage parents with their small children to do, because parents like to sit in the back because then they can make a quick exit, or they think no one will, their child won't disturb anybody. Well, when your child's sitting in the back, they can't see anything, so they're going to be a little bit more rambunctious, and they are going to make noise. Up front, you can see everything. But there was a family who always sat up front, And one Sunday, and then there on out, and the girl was 5 or 6, during the Eucharistic prayer, she would stand up and she would put her hands up in the orans position when the priest did. And she was just modeling what the celebrant was doing. And everyone was like, what is she doing? And I'm like, pay attention. What's going on here? This child is really getting this, for sure. Whoops. Helps. Click through all these. Helps for adults, because adults, I think, are the ones that really need the help more than the kids do sometimes. So like I mentioned, the pamphlets. Some churches like to save seats and sections just for families. That can be really helpful because they feel safety in numbers. However, if the parents aren't engaging with their children, it becomes a free-for-all for all the kids together then, while the parents are just figuring, oh, they can just all play here. And that's not teaching them anything. So I always really encourage parents to, have a child next to you quietly. You can whisper, you can talk to them. And children know it's a different, you've got your church voice for doing that. Have kids look up the hymns in the hymnal ahead of time, all of that. And then there's soft space in church, or a prayer space, or prayer area, a variety of names that people have. It might be just a rocking chair that's in the back of the church or on the side somewhere for a mom who's got an infant, or a dad or a grandma who's got a small child. Having a soft space is really helpful as long as there's an adult in that soft space also. Because that can also become a real play area, which is nothing's wrong with that, but then the children kind of lose focus with what's going on, and then they start playing with each other and having conversations about what we're doing, when really it's to provide them a place to move around in, to be able to still see what's going on and to absorb those kinds of things for that. And of course, there's all kinds of things that kids can do together. And one of the handouts that you also have go into a little bit more specifics about all of these things of how we can be multi-generational. Children of all ages can sing, can usher, can read. Depending on permissions, they can give communion. There are some bishops who have said it's okay for a child to administer communion. I mean, that goes against canons in some regard, but bishops have given permission in family services when there are lots of children present to help set the table, to stand around the altar and things like that. So you just need to check with Bishop Rickle on those kinds of things. I mean, and it all depends on what your setting and your context is for that. Sermons can take a variety of forms. They can be dramas, they can be interviews. Children can make bulletin cover art, banners, kite streamers, and certainly writing prayers. So the document that you have, there are some steps for writing liturgy with children and youth, for writing prayers of the people, for all of those things. And we can do that. The rubrics and the Book of Common Prayer have a pattern or a template for doing those kinds of things. So you can do that. Questions? Of course, I'm running out of time again, as usual. What are some things that have worked really well with all of you that you'd like to share? You may be on.
I've worked with the children in various churches over the last 20 years. And I always find ways to develop little mini liturgies to happen at least monthly within the main church service, so that the kids have something that they're looking forward to and are really excited about. And then all the adults are just amazed at what the kids can do. So.
Mm-hmm. And part of that too is to make that a regular thing.
Yes.
So, I mean, there are lots of churches who might have Youth Sunday or Children's Sundays, but what if youth were regularly in your rota of lectors, or children were regularly in the rota of ushers and greeters with their their families. Yeah. So it becomes second nature.
Yep. All the kids, they're in charge of taking up the elements each Sunday. And boy, they race back there to the back table and they are just ready to go.
Great. Thanks. Any other ideas that have worked well for anyone? Does anyone have any questions?
Sharon, I have a question. I noticed in a couple of handouts on the maybe 2 or 3 screens back, you had the point that parents should not be the only ones responsible for their children. And we do a lot of child participation in the service. And one thing that we've really struggled with is what is the responsibility? Oh, there it is. Yep. So the children come back in for communion every week. And some parents, I think, who are kind of overwhelmed and want to concentrate on communion, let their kids just out. So then they are running up and down the hallways. And so that's been a problem area for us about how to handle that with grace, and being very generous of spirit with the children and the parents and also the other folks who are there. Do you have any suggestions for?
Well, part of, I mean, long time ago when in a previous parish, when we started having children in worship for the whole time, we had education at a separate hour. There were parents who were like, my child cannot, I need worship. And, you know, so my child can't, you know, I don't want my child in worship with me. So we had to have a lot of conversations and forums at that period of time when we were in that transition. And part of what we did is, so children were in worship for the entire service, and we made sure that there were things for them to do. And we talked with parents about how to engage your child in worship, that parents should have expectations of the behavior of their children. But at the time of the sermon, what we did, because parents said they couldn't focus on a service, they wanted to hear the sermon without having to, you know, read a story to their child. The children came out during the sermon and had a sermon in a room nearby. And those were like 5th grade and under. That was a sermon at their level, so parents could have that time to actually focus on the sermon. And then the children came back. But part of the understanding was that, or if parents really couldn't, we would find other people that children could sit with also, that they didn't mind doing that. And that was sort of a thing that kind of worked out over time. Kids kind of gravitated toward those adults who they knew would enjoy their presence in worship. But we really kind of frowned upon kids wandering around in the building when people were in worship, for safe church practices and a lot of reasons because of that safety. For that.
It does strike me that that's a real safeguarding issue. And it just creating that ethos and having those conversations, as you said. I think the conversations with parents are also really important. So thank you. Appreciate that.
Something that we do at my church, I'm at St. John's in Kirkland, is our children do leave for the sermon and they leave for the reading to go to Godly Play, but then the Godly Play teachers are kind of in charge of the children in the church. We've got a children's area they all go to when they come back in, and so the parents can still have that time. It's just kind of part of their Sunday morning duty the week that they're storytelling.
And that makes it hard for one of the other reasons why, you know, besides we just wanted children to worship all the time, is teachers wanted to be in worship. They wanted to be experienced worship themselves also and not have to be with kids all the time. So that's another balance. But if you have a rotating group of teachers.
Yeah, we've got a rotating group. So each of our teachers, besides myself, only serves one Sunday a month.
Okay, I'd just like to comment about, I can't say what we do at our church because I'm fairly new, but I did take several years of catechesis of the Good Shepherd. And what I'm hearing from your presentations is really exciting to me, because it's like you've taken a lot of what I got out of catechesis training and put it right smack in the middle of worship. And I just think that's a beautiful transition. So I really like it.
Oh, good. Because oftentimes both godly play and catechesis, I mean, those are separate entities, because children are part of, it's a very worshipful setting. So that, if one were to do the whole, the way those, sessions are intended, they could be 3 hours long, with work and with doing, worship in its own way by having a feast and things like that. But it's the same pattern, and children know what that pattern is. So I have found that children who have, had been in catechesis or godly play are welcome, are open to being in worship, because they're used to silence also, and not being, ramped up, playing a lot of, games. Not that games are bad to do that, but it's hard to be in church school playing really active games, or just sitting and reading, coloring or Bible stories and things, and then to suddenly have to go into a worship setting and be very quiet. That's what's the difficult shift in being able to do that. And I have no answers for that.
So, my name's Michelle Chapman, and several of us are from St. Stephen's in Oak Harbor. Some of the things that I have done is taken the beginning of the Sunday school year and taken pictures of areas of the church, the altar. We've done like little field trips during coffee hour to look, go back into the sacristy, so that these elements are not foreign to the kids. The kids are familiar with them. And we've talked about how do we act in church? How do we, if you have trouble, keeping still, then let's find something for you to do. We have tables in the back, we have coloring paper pages, but I do, especially if there's a family of, kind of wild children. I mean, we do an instruction, and sometimes it takes several instructions. Sometimes it takes several instructions, and several times we've even done handicap. We've brought canes in, wheelchairs. This is how, if you see a wheelchair, you need to stop and let those people pass. I mean, because some kids they just don't know. And the parents, several of you are very right. The parents are there to worship, and they need to worship. I'm very comfortable with taking kids, and sit with me in the pew. It doesn't matter to me. So that's kind of what we do. If we get a batch of new kids that just don't know what to do. We also have, I also have some of our clergy come down periodically into this classroom and do special lessons on the Eucharist, on the liturgy, we had one that brought the stole and the all the stuff, so the kids can touch and feel and ask questions, and that alleviates a lot of disinterest.
Those are great ideas. I mean, going and having a tour of the sacristy and seeing where all those special things are secretly kept, and I mean, that's a mystery, and most adults don't know where those things are. So
right,
children in, and I think, I mean, since so many of our adults have not been formed in this way, we can do things together in household units for those kinds of things, under the guise that this is for children, because adults are going to learn from that too. And so we're all going to be formed together doing that. And, being in a worship setting and a space is different than most other places that we go to. So it's there are expectations for children's behavior in school and adult behavior. Oftentimes adults make a whole lot more noise than children in church, talking and whispering and, unwrapping candy wrappers and cough drops and things. And it's not the children, or their phones are ringing. No offense there, but, when those kinds of things, at church. Any other questions or?
I have a question, but probably one that can't be solved in this meeting. I was just wondering if there was, we just have some specific variables that I think I might need some help brainstorming. I don't know if the conversation needs to happen with you, Valerie, or even the architecture of our church is sort of beautiful, but it's the sort of dungeon situation. So I almost feel like we have an upstairs downstairs thing going on, like a bit Downton Abbey. It's like we don't want to see them. We know they exist. I get the sense that people love babies, but not children. People love them in the bellies, and people love them sort of in a burrito, but they don't love them beyond that, because the contemplative worship experience is so precious. Mm-hmm. So I was just kind of wondering if there's a different a way that we could talk about it, because I don't want to flesh out the boring details for the whole group.
A great book that I recommend. That's fairly new, maybe a year or so ago it came out, and it's called Love First.
Okay.
LOVEFIRST, Love First.
Okay.
It's written by, and now it's a whole, I think she has a nonprofit now called Love First. So if you just Google Love First, she's on Cape Cod in, I think, Barnstable, Massachusetts. Okay. But she had an issue in that children weren't coming to church school and families weren't coming to church. Their church they had an education building on a huge piece of property that was separate from the sanctuary. So children couldn't even enter the sanctuary when it came time to, and there weren't any bathrooms, and all kinds of logistical problems. Plus, the adults in the parish didn't understand why families weren't coming. And it was because of that hospitality issue. There were all kinds of issues that she had, and she spent a whole lot of time in research and developed this amazing ministry. And she ended up, I edited the book with her. It's called Love.
Wonderful. Thank you. And what was her name? I missed her name.
Colette Potts.
Colette Potts.
Yes, Potts. It's called Love First, and Church Publishing published it.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you.
Could you say the last name again? I couldn't tell if it was C or P.
P as in Peter, Potts, Colette Potts. And it's just called Love First. And she has a website with all kinds of, and I think she's been putting out some free resources for children during this time.
I think the issue Tina brings up is one that we've been struggling with for a little while. And we do have, there's someone who's dedicated to this issue right now on behalf of the diocese, and her project is called Making Space for Children and Families. And it looks at both the physical space, which is so often in our older buildings a challenge. It's the physical space, as you point out, Tina, feels dungeon-like. It's not welcoming to children and families. And most families today are very attuned to aesthetics and color and light. And so more so than maybe a generation ago, that has to feel welcoming. But then the other side is, of course, the culture of welcome and, psychologically making space for children and families, which we kind of touched on earlier, Sharon, when we were talking, how do you get, and the question you asked was, what is your congregation's attitude toward children? And for those of us that work with children and families, how do we move them forward to be more welcoming? So huge overview, but you have some thoughts on that, Sharon.
I would look at the Awake My Soul link in the handout that you have, which is a great resource that was put together by the Office of Children's Ministries years ago at the Church Center. It has ways to totally engage all ages in liturgy in non-threatening ways through, more creative prayer in some senses, in some ways. And there's that whole process of authority of all generations, which allows the elder's voice to be heard as wisdom and the child's voice to be heard as the prophet. And it's sort of, it can be advertised as a hymn sing, because there's a lot of hymn singing going on with it, but it allows some great ways to really hear what the values of a community are, for that.
And where was that reference? I Googled Awake My Soul, but I'm getting a lot of
You're getting hymns
singing.
and things like that. The link is in the document that was emailed out to everyone.
Oh.
And it's called
Michelle,
Awake.
you have that?
It's on page 4 of the handout.
Michelle,
Annie, yeah, I have that. I'll forward
oh,
that
great.
to you.
Okay, thanks.
Hi, my name is Gretchen Moore, and I'm with St. Stephen's in Longview, Washington. And one of the things we really have difficulty with, I shouldn't say difficulty, I mean, we're working with a situation. Like a Pew Research study recently indicated that families now view regular church attendance in a very different way than families in the past did, where regular church attendance is now defined by many as attending church once a month. So where I find myself kind of stumbling and in my interactions with the children is the continuity factor. Not all the children are on the same page, and it's really remarkable because most Sundays I may have between 1 and 3 to 4 kids. Other Sundays, all of them will show up on the same Sunday, and they're all on completely different pages. In that same regard, because I think of the intermittent attendance, which is, I don't want to sound like I'm judging parents for that, because our families have so many different reasons for why this is the norm in their life. They're really under a lot of stresses and a lot of other different factors playing in on a Sunday morning. But I find we found that some of our children just weren't even comfortable being separated from their parents for Sunday school during the coffee hour time even. And so I basically shuttered my downstairs classroom. We now have their little coffee during coffee hour upstairs in the parish hall. I have a special table off to the side where we do type of Sunday school format. And we've had to really adjust to do kind of a high speed, low drag, because there is a lot of interruption from the just general noise in the parish hall. And so I've really had to change how I reach the kids with anything. I was wondering if you had any insight into dealing with this type of situation.
Well, what you're expressing is happening all over. And that is why I believe that Sunday school will be a thing of the past in the future. Lots of families, when they do come to church, if they're coming with their children, they want to be with their children in church. And church school doesn't matter, especially because of the continuity. I mean, more recent statistics, I think, say regular church attendance is every 5 to 6 weeks, not even just once a month now. And, so there isn't that being able to develop a relationship with a Sunday school teacher over a period of time, and especially building on consecutive lessons or being able to put the whole story together is really hard when it's hit or miss. So more congregations are trying to support and do family education as opposed to just focusing on children, but helping parents being able to talk with their children about things. So not giving a child a Bible, but giving a family a Bible, whatever that family unit is, and then doing some adult formation with adults on how do we use this? How do we make the time? And I think the growing edge of resources for curriculum and things are ones that are home-based and for families to use, faith at home types of things. So you're not alone in your struggle. I mean, that's, and for children, coffee hour is the best part of going to church. You get to have good snacks and you get to have fun and meet other people, and you're building relationships that oftentimes they're not getting in other places. So that's,
yeah, the children seem to be responding very well to that new location. Anytime they feel like they need to go just touch base with mom and dad during the class, they're cool to go over and say hey, check in, and then they wander back over to the table. So we're adjusting to a lot of new normals, but I think it's going well. So.
No, it sounds like you've been real creative in trying to develop new workarounds and things. And today's small child and children are super, any child born after 9/11 is a whole lot more protected than ever. And parents are a lot less hesitant to let kids go. A lot of people don't want to put their children in an infant in a nursery anymore. It used to be, oh yeah, this is great, I get a morning off. There's more hesitation in that now. Yes.
Yeah, we've closed our nursery.
In my experience, I feel like there's a gap in sort of the stuff we're being trained in. It's very linear, and like we're all working with variables that don't fit in this sort of 10 to 12 or 20 person classroom with continuity. We're working with architecture that is different from a different time. We're working with parents that show up intermittently. And what I felt is the gap is that parents themselves are kind of like you said, their faith is being formed. And some of them are back because their kids are asking questions about God that they don't quite know how to answer. And so in some ways, I feel like my ministering is has to be inclusive of them. So for me personally, something I'm experimenting with, especially in the context of the pandemic, is I send out a weekly or bi-weekly newsletter where I just kind of talk about my ordinary life, but I'm sort of essentially talking about the sacred in the ordinary. So I'm telling stories about my life right now and my kid right now. And the response has been really great because I think that for a lot of folks, it's something you do on a Sunday. It's that integration piece, I think, is a little fuzzy. And not a little, a lot fuzzy. There's a lot of folks that I guess would be qualified as nuns that are sort of dipping their toes in. They're not really sure. We are in a downtown location, but they live very far. So even CGS, which I'm training in, I'm kind of like, no one's going to come to do the work on a Wednesday. How am I going to get a bunch of people to show up on a Wednesday? But CGS during service doesn't work. So yeah, it's a bit, I feel like we all have to kind of intuit what is, who needs it. And right now I'm sort of intuiting that maybe the parents need it. So that maybe the most I can expect is that they have a sense of calm and not really a whole Easter liturgy that they can do in house church with their kids. That just seems like that's too far.
Right. I mean, there's great resources. I mean, I discussed in the keynote, if you want to go back and look at some of those kind of things, because I talked about a lot of these issues, but buildfaith.org is a great resource for all kinds of things. Grow Christians is another, and all of those are, on the there's a handout from the keynote that's probably on the diocesan website that lists all those kinds of really good resources for helping families and things like that. Love First is another one. She really talks about a lot of these issues, and that, ditch the curriculum piece. And I work for a company that made curriculum. So I'm saying you are the curriculum. Each of you are the curriculum, because you are the relationship and the example of what it means to be a Christian. Any other questions in the queue, Valerie?
I think we're good. Thank you so much, everyone. Just want to remind you that next week, Sharon wraps up her continuing education series with Testing God, the Spirituality of Youth. And then we have a plan for either an online meeting or an in-person meeting in June. I think it's June 24th, that Wednesday. And we'll be talking about messy church. And I don't know if any of you have dabbled in that. If you have, I would love to hear from you. But that's an intergenerational approach to church and faith formation, where the whole family's together. And anyway, that should be really interesting. And I'd love also to hear about how you are doing your children and families gatherings virtually now in the context of COVID-19. We were talking a little bit about that before the meeting too. So thank you, Sharon. We can continue the conversation online or via email, and hope to see all of you soon. Thanks for holding things together at your church.
Thank you very much.
Great to be with you all. Thank you.